In the late morning of November 13th, 2022, at exactly 11:56 a.m., the Moscow Police Department received a chilling 911 call. The call was answered by dispatcher Karolina Calvin. On the other end of the line were terrified voices of students from the University of Idaho. They had just discovered something was terribly wrong inside their home. 4 of their friends had been killed. Madison Mogen, Kaylee Goncalves, Ethan Chapin, and Xana Kernodle had all been fatally stabbed inside an off-campus house in Moscow, Idaho. The news would soon shock the entire community and beyond. The night before the murders had seemed like any other Saturday night in the small college town of Moscow, Idaho. It was the kind of evening filled with parties, laughter, and young people making plans with their friends. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary at first. That evening, 20-year-old Ethan Chapin had attended a fraternity formal event. He went with his twin sister, who was visiting for the weekend. After the formal ended, Ethan headed to his Sigma Chi fraternity house. His girlfriend, 20-year-old Xana Kernodle, was with him. The couple spent time together at the fraternity house, enjoying what they thought would be just another typical college night. Meanwhile, Madison Mogen and Kaylee Goncalves were spending their evening differently. The 2 young women were inseparable best friends who did almost everything together. That night, they decided to go out to the Corner Club, a popular local bar in downtown Moscow. It was a place where many university students liked to gather on weekend nights. While they were at the bar, something noteworthy happened. Kaylee briefly ran into her ex-boyfriend, Jack. The 2 had recently ended a long-term relationship that had lasted through much of their time at the university. The breakup was still fresh, and seeing each other that night would later become an important detail in the investigation. None of them knew that this ordinary Saturday night would be their last. Around 1:40 inches the morning, after leaving the bar, Madison and Kaylee walked together to a well-known late-night food spot called the Grub Truck. The food truck was located in Friendship Square, a popular gathering place in downtown Moscow. Many college students stopped there after a night out to grab something to eat before heading home. The 2 friends ordered their food and waited for a short time while their meals were prepared. Security cameras in the area captured footage of them standing by the truck, talking and laughing together. After getting their food, they left with their meals in hand. By 1:56 a.m., they had made it back to their home on King Road. The house on King Road had 3 floors, and the roommates were spread throughout the building. Kaylee and Madison shared the 3rd floor, which was the top level of the house. Interestingly, Kaylee had recently moved out of the house and was living elsewhere. However, that particular weekend, she had returned to visit Madison. She was excited to show her best friend a new car she had just purchased. That night, the 2 inseparable friends decided to sleep together in Madison's bedroom on the 3rd floor. The 2nd floor of the house was where most of the common areas were located. It held the kitchen, Xana's bedroom, and another roommate's room belonging to Dylan Mortensen. Xana's boyfriend, Ethan, had decided to stay the night with her in her bedroom on the 2nd floor. Meanwhile, the house had one more roommate named Bethany Funke, who went to bed in her own room on the 1st floor, which was the ground level of the house. At 4 a.m., Xana received a DoorDash food delivery that she had ordered. The delivery person dropped off the food at the house. It was around this same time that something terrible began to unfold. The attacker entered the house through a sliding glass door that was located near the kitchen on the 2nd floor. He was carrying a Ka-bar knife, which is a large military-style combat knife. He quietly moved through the house and walked upstairs to the 3rd floor. According to investigators who later studied the crime scene and gathered evidence, the attacker had a specific target in mind. His target was one of the girls who was sleeping upstairs on the 3rd floor. He walked directly to the bedroom where Kaylee and Madison were sleeping peacefully together, completely unaware of the danger. Without warning, he attacked them both in their sleep. At about 4:17 a.m., a security camera that was positioned less than 50 feet away from Xana's bedroom window recorded several disturbing sounds coming from inside the house. The camera picked up audio of a dog barking repeatedly, muffled voices that were difficult to make out clearly, what sounded like a whimper or cry of distress, and then a loud thud, as if something heavy had fallen to the floor. These sounds would later become crucial pieces of evidence in understanding what happened that night. Dylan Mortensen, one of the roommates who was sleeping in her bedroom on the 2nd floor, suddenly woke up to strange noises. The sounds were coming from directly above her room, from the 3rd floor where Kaylee and Madison were sleeping. At first, Dylan didn't think much of it. She assumed it was probably just Kaylee playing with her dog, Murphy, who also lived in the house. It seemed like a reasonable explanation for the commotion above her head. But then Dylan heard something that made her feel uneasy. She heard a voice call out, "There's someone here." The voice sounded alarmed and frightened. That voice most likely belonged to Xana, who had just received her DoorDash food delivery and may have been awake eating her late-night meal. After the attacker, later identified as Bryan Kohberger, had killed Kaylee and Madison on the 3rd floor, he made his way back down the stairs toward the 2nd floor. As he descended the staircase, he unexpectedly crossed paths with Xana. She was in the wrong place at the wrong time. Xana realized the danger she was in and fought back against her attacker with everything she had. She fought bravely and desperately for her life, trying to defend herself against the man with the knife. Unfortunately, despite her courageous efforts to survive, the attacker overpowered her. He was stronger and had the advantage of surprise and a deadly weapon. He killed her in her own bedroom. Dylan, still in her room and hearing the strange sounds, decided to open her bedroom door to see what was going on. She looked out into the hallway but didn't see anything unusual at first. Everything appeared quiet and normal, so she closed her door again. But just moments later, Dylan heard more disturbing sounds. This time, she heard what sounded like someone crying or sobbing. The sounds were coming from Xana's room, which was just down the hall from her own bedroom. The crying sounds were heartbreaking and filled with pain. When Dylan opened her bedroom door for the 2nd time to investigate, she heard something even more chilling. She heard a male voice speaking. The voice said calmly, "It's okay. I'm going to help you." The words sounded reassuring, but they were actually terrifying given what was really happening. Ethan, who had been sleeping peacefully in Xana's room with his girlfriend, likely woke up to the sounds of the attack on Xana. He may have tried to protect her or defend himself. Tragically, he was then stabbed to death by the attacker as well. Dylan opened her bedroom door for the 3rd time. This time, what she saw would haunt her forever. She saw a figure dressed entirely in black clothing walking toward her in the hallway. The person was wearing a mask that covered his mouth and nose, making it impossible to see his full face. He had bushy eyebrows that were visible above the mask. The figure walked directly past Dylan's open doorway, heading toward the back sliding glass door to exit the house. He didn't seem to notice her, or perhaps he simply chose not to harm her. Dylan stood frozen in fear as the masked man passed by just feet away from her. According to Dylan's account of what happened, the masked figure moved quickly toward the kitchen area. He then slipped out through the same sliding glass door he had used to enter the house. Within seconds, he had vanished into the darkness of the early morning, leaving behind a scene of unimaginable horror. Dylan stood completely frozen in fear in her doorway. Her body wouldn't move. She was paralyzed by the shock and terror of what she had just witnessed. Her mind was racing, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Was that real? Did she really just see a strange man in a mask walking through her house? The fear was overwhelming and all-consuming. When Dylan finally managed to move again, she quickly shut her bedroom door and locked it. Her hands were shaking as she reached for her phone on her nightstand. She was terrified and confused, and her first instinct was not to call the police, but to reach out to her friends. She needed someone to talk to, someone who could help her understand what was happening. She needed to know she wasn't alone. Bethany Funke, the other surviving roommate who had been sleeping in her bedroom on the 1st floor, answered Dylan's messages. She had been asleep and unaware of anything unusual happening in the house above her. The two roommates began frantically exchanging confused and panicked text messages back and forth. Dylan's messages were filled with fear and desperation. She wrote that she had been trying to get the attention of their other roommates upstairs, but no one was responding to her. She told Bethany that she was scared and didn't know what to do. Her hands were probably trembling as she typed out each word. Then Dylan told Bethany exactly what she had just seen with her own eyes. There had been a man inside their house. He was dressed entirely in black clothing from head to toe. He was wearing something over his face that covered most of his features, almost like a ski mask that people wear when skiing in cold weather. The description was specific and frightening. At first, Bethany didn't believe what Dylan was telling her. It sounded too crazy, too unreal. She thought maybe Dylan was confused or had been dreaming. Perhaps she had mistaken a roommate for an intruder, or maybe she was playing some kind of prank. It just didn't make sense that a strange man would be in their house in the middle of the night. But Dylan insisted she wasn't joking around. She repeated what she had seen, making it clear that this was real and serious. The fear in her messages was obvious. She wasn't making this up or exaggerating. Something terrible had happened, and she had witnessed it. When Bethany finally realized that Dylan was telling the truth and wasn't joking, she became frightened too. The reality of the situation began to sink in for both of them. If there had been a strange man in their house, where was he now? Was he still inside? Were they in danger? Bethany immediately urged Dylan to leave her room and come downstairs to the first floor. She wanted them to be together so they wouldn't be alone. They could protect each other and figure out what to do next. At around 4:26 a.m., approximately 9 minutes after the security camera had recorded those disturbing sounds, Dylan finally left the relative safety of her locked bedroom. She carefully made her way through the house and went downstairs to join Bethany on the first floor. However, on her way down to Bethany's room, Dylan saw something absolutely horrifying that would be burned into her memory forever. As she passed by Xana's bedroom, she could see inside. Xana was lying motionless on the floor of her bedroom. Dylan's mind, still trying to process everything and perhaps in denial about how serious the situation really was, convinced her that Xana was probably just very drunk and had passed out on the floor. She didn't stop to check on Xana or try to wake her up. Dylan continued walking down to Bethany's room on the first floor. When she arrived, the two terrified roommates locked themselves inside Bethany's bedroom together. They stayed there, huddled together in fear, trying to make sense of what had happened and what they should do next. For hours and hours, Dylan and Bethany tried desperately to reach their housemates who lived upstairs. They sent text message after text message to Madison, Kaylee, Xana, and Ethan. They tried calling their phones over and over again, hoping someone would pick up and explain what was going on. But none of their friends upstairs answered any of their messages or calls. Every text went unread. Every phone call went straight to voicemail or rang endlessly without anyone picking up. The silence was deafening and increasingly worrying. Why wasn't anyone responding? Where were they? What was happening? Dylan and Bethany sat together in the locked bedroom, their anxiety and confusion growing with each passing hour. They were too afraid to go upstairs and check on their friends themselves, remembering the masked man Dylan had seen. They didn't know if it was safe or what they might find if they went up there. By late morning, with the eerie silence still hanging heavily over the entire house like a dark cloud, Dylan finally decided to call some of their other friends who didn't live in the house. She asked them to please come over and help them figure out what was going on. She explained that something strange had happened during the night and that none of their roommates were answering their phones. They needed help. When these friends arrived at the King Road house, they were also confused and concerned by the situation. The house seemed quiet and still. One of the friends who had arrived volunteered to go upstairs to check on everyone and see if they were okay. Perhaps they had all just been sleeping very deeply and hadn't heard their phones, he thought. He climbed the stairs, probably calling out their names as he went. What he discovered upstairs was absolutely horrifying and traumatic. He found Ethan Chapin and Xana Kernodle in Xana's bedroom. He checked them and realized with shock and horror that they had no pulse. They weren't breathing. They were dead. The scene was gruesome and disturbing, and he couldn't believe what he was seeing. The friend rushed back downstairs as fast as he could, his face probably pale with shock. He told Dylan, Bethany, and the rest of the friends who had gathered what he had just seen upstairs. The news was devastating and terrifying. Everyone was in complete shock and panic. They couldn't comprehend what was happening. How could their friends be dead? At exactly 11:56 a.m., more than 7 hours after the attack had occurred, Bethany finally dialed 911 on her phone with shaking hands. When the dispatcher answered, Bethany reported that there was an unconscious person in their house. She needed help immediately. The dispatcher asked questions and sent emergency responders to the address right away. Police officers from the Moscow Police Department arrived at the scene just minutes later, their sirens probably wailing as they raced to the King Road house. When they entered the home and began to investigate, they walked into one of the most disturbing and violent crime scenes they had ever encountered in their entire careers. It was worse than anything they could have imagined. The scene was brutal and heartbreaking. All 4 victims had been attacked with devastating force. A knife had torn through the young victims with terrible violence, causing massive injuries. The officers found Madison Mogen, Kaylee Goncalves, Xana Kernodle, and Ethan Chapin all dead in their bedrooms. The house that had been full of life and laughter just hours before was now a crime scene filled with tragedy. In Madison Mogen's bedroom on the 3rd floor lying near the bodies of Madison and her best friend Kaylee Goncalves, the investigators made a crucial discovery. They found a brown leather knife sheath, which is the protective covering that holds a knife when it's not being used. The sheath was stamped with the emblem and logo of the United States Marine Corps, the branch of the U.S. military. This was a military-style knife sheath, suggesting the weapon used was a large combat knife. The leather knife sheath was carefully collected by the forensic team and taken as evidence. It would become one of the most important pieces of physical evidence in the entire investigation. This single item would eventually help investigators track down and identify the attacker who had committed these horrible crimes. The killer had made a critical mistake by leaving it behind at the crime scene. Xana Kernodle and Ethan Chapin were found dead in Xana's second-floor bedroom. The scene told a story of the final moments of their lives. Xana's body was lying on the floor of her bedroom, suggesting she may have tried to escape or fight back against her attacker. Ethan, who had also suffered multiple stab wounds throughout his body, was still in bed when he was found. He may have been killed while he was sleeping, or just as he was waking up to the commotion. All 4 young victims had been stabbed to death with a large knife. The medical examiner would later confirm that their deaths were homicides caused by sharp force injuries. Importantly, investigators noted that none of the victims were tied up or restrained with rope or anything else. There was also no sign of sexual assault on any of the victims. This suggested that the motive for these killings was something other than sexual violence. The attacker's purpose appeared to be simply to kill. The autopsy reports revealed the horrific extent of the violence that had occurred that night. Kaylee Goncalves had suffered more than 20 stab wounds covering her body, along with other serious injuries. The attack on her had been brutal and sustained, but Xana Kernodle's wounds were even more severe and numerous. She had over 50 stab wounds on her body. Many of these wounds were what investigators call defensive wounds, which are injuries that occur when a victim tries to protect themselves by putting up their hands and arms to block the attacker's knife. These defensive wounds showed clearly how fiercely and bravely Xana had fought for her life against her attacker. She didn't give up without a fight. She resisted with everything she had, trying desperately to survive. The investigation into these murders began immediately after the bodies were discovered. The Moscow Police Department took the lead on the case, since the crimes had occurred in their jurisdiction. However, they quickly realized they would need additional resources and expertise to solve such a complex and high-profile case. The Idaho State Police stepped in to provide additional investigators and support. The Federal Bureau of Investigation, known as the FBI, also joined the investigation, bringing their specialized skills, technology, and resources to help solve the case. Investigators worked around the clock, following every possible lead. The entire neighborhood surrounding the King Road house was thoroughly canvassed. Officers went door to door asking residents if they had seen or heard anything unusual during the early morning hours of November 13th. They also searched for any security cameras or doorbell cameras that might have captured footage of a person or vehicle near the house around the time of the murders. Cell tower data from the area was pulled and analyzed. This data could show which cell phones were in the area at the time of the murders and could help investigators track the movements of potential suspects. Every piece of technology and every investigative tool available was being used to find the killer. The police department also made a public appeal for help. They asked anyone in the community who might have information, no matter how small or insignificant it might seem, to please come forward and provide tips that could help solve the case. They set up a tip line where people could call in anonymously if they preferred. That same evening, after news of the murders spread throughout the community, the University of Idaho made the difficult decision to cancel all classes for the following day, Monday, November 14th. Students, faculty, and staff were in shock and mourning. The campus community needed time to process the tragic loss of 4 of their own. A candlelight vigil was initially planned to take place on the campus lawn for November 16th, just 3 days after the murders. A candlelight vigil is a peaceful gathering where people come together to remember and honor those who have died, often by lighting candles and sharing memories. However, the vigil was later postponed for 2 weeks to allow more time for families to arrive and for the community to prepare a proper memorial for the 4 students. The investigation moved forward very quickly as dozens of investigators worked day and night on the case. 10 days after the tragic incident occurred, on November 23rd, the Moscow police chief held a press conference to update the public on the progress of the investigation. Press conferences are meetings where officials speak to news reporters and the public about important developments in a case. During this press conference, the police chief confirmed that authorities had received hundreds of tips from the public. People from the local community and from around the country had called in with information they thought might be helpful. Among these many tips were several claims and reports that Kaylee Goncalves may have had a stalker in the weeks or months before her death. A stalker is someone who follows, watches, or harasses another person in an unwanted and often threatening way. This information was being taken seriously and investigated thoroughly as a possible lead in the case. In the weeks leading up to the murders, Kaylee Goncalves had confided in one of her roommates that something felt wrong and unsettling. She told her roommate that she believed a man had been watching her while she was out walking her dog, Murphy, around the neighborhood. This wasn't just a passing glance from a stranger. Kaylee described the man's behavior as creepy and disturbing. She said he would stand on the hill just behind their house at King Road, silently staring at her without saying anything or moving. He would just watch her in complete silence, which made Kaylee feel extremely uncomfortable and unsafe. The roommates took Kaylee's concerns seriously because the behavior she described was genuinely frightening. Being watched by a stranger who doesn't speak or explain why they're there is an alarming experience that would make anyone feel threatened and vulnerable. Then, making the situation even more concerning, a couple of weeks after Kaylee first mentioned the man watching her, the roommates discovered that their front door had been damaged. The door looked like someone had tried to force it open, or had kicked it or hit it with something. This physical damage to their home was deeply unsettling. Was someone trying to break into their house? Was it the same man Kaylee had seen watching her? The roommates didn't know for sure, but the timing of the damaged door made them worried that these incidents might be connected. After the police chief's press conference on November 23rd, where he mentioned that Kaylee may have had a stalker, one of the first major pieces of public evidence quickly surfaced and spread across social media and news outlets. This evidence came from the night of November 12th, the same night Madison and Kaylee left the Corner Club bar and walked to the Grub Truck, a popular local food stand in downtown Moscow where students often went for late-night meals. What many people didn't know at the time was that the Grub Truck had been live streaming video on Twitch, a popular streaming platform, during the hours it was open that night. This meant that everything happening around the food truck was being recorded and broadcast live to the internet. After the murders became national news, people online who were interested in the case began carefully combing through hours and hours of the Twitch footage, looking for any clues or suspicious behavior that might help solve the case. In the video footage from that night, Madison and Kaylee could clearly be seen standing near the Grub Truck, waiting patiently for their food orders to be prepared. They were talking to each other, laughing, and occasionally meeting and chatting with other people who were nearby. They looked happy and relaxed, just two friends enjoying a night out together with no idea of the tragedy that would occur just hours later. But as internet sleuths studied the footage more carefully, they noticed something that caught their attention and raised red flags. Behind Madison and Kaylee, standing just a short distance away from them, was a young man wearing a gray hoodie sweatshirt. His behavior in the video seemed unusual and suspicious to many people who watched it. He appeared to be watching the two girls very closely, staring at them for extended periods of time without looking away. His body language and the way he moved seemed deliberate and focused on the two women. He would position himself near them, watch them intently, and his movements raised suspicions among those analyzing the video. Many people online became convinced that this man in the gray hoodie might be the stalker that Kaylee had mentioned, or perhaps even the killer himself. The video was shared widely on social media platforms like Twitter, TikTok, and Reddit. Amateur detectives zoomed in on the footage, slowed it down, and tried to identify the man's face and features. Speculation ran wild, and some people even tried to identify who the man was based on his appearance. The video and the theories surrounding the man in the gray hoodie reached the investigators working on the case. The Moscow Police Department took this potential lead very seriously and devoted resources to tracking down and identifying the man in the video. They wanted to know who he was, why he was there, and whether he had any connection to the victims or the murders. Despite this piece of evidence generating so much public interest and attention, the investigators were ultimately unable to move further forward on the case based on this particular lead. After conducting their investigation and interviewing the individual, they determined that the man in the gray hoodie was found, identified, and then completely cleared of any involvement in the murders. He had a solid alibi for where he was during the time of the killings, and there was no evidence connecting him to the crime. He was simply someone who happened to be at the food truck at the same time as Madison and Kaylee, and his behavior, while perhaps appearing unusual on video, was innocent and unrelated to what would happen later that night. This was disappointing news for investigators and for the public who had hoped this lead would break the case wide open. the investigation would need to continue looking in other directions to find the real killer. Days after the press conference on November 23rd, investigators were working tirelessly to gather every possible piece of evidence they could find. They were able to pull and collect all the surveillance camera footage they could get from houses throughout the neighborhood surrounding King Road. Many homeowners in the area had doorbell cameras, security cameras, and other recording devices that might have captured something important during the early morning hours of November 13th. As investigators carefully reviewed hours and hours of this surveillance footage from multiple cameras throughout the neighborhood, they noticed something extremely important and potentially significant. A white car was seen moving through the area on the night of the murders. This wasn't just a car passing through once. The pattern of its movements was highly suspicious and unusual. The vehicle was recorded by multiple cameras driving past the King Road house multiple times during a critical time window. The first sighting was at 3:29 a.m., about 30 minutes before the murders are believed to have occurred. Over the next several minutes, the car was captured circling the neighborhood 3 times, as if the driver was looking for something or someone, or perhaps working up the courage to do something. This repeated circling behavior was very unusual for that time of night in a quiet residential neighborhood. At 4:04 a.m., right around the time investigators believed the attacks were taking place inside the house, the same white car returned to the area again. The timing was incredibly suspicious and aligned almost perfectly with when the murders occurred. Then, just 16 minutes later, at 4:20 a.m., the same white car was seen on camera again, but this time it was speeding away from the neighborhood at a high rate of speed, as if the driver was in a hurry to leave the area as quickly as possible. This became the biggest and most promising lead that investigators had gotten on the case since they first began their investigation. The white car's movements were too specific and too perfectly timed to be a coincidence. Whoever was driving that car almost certainly had some connection to the murders, and very likely was the killer himself. Investigators immediately began working to identify what type of car it was. By enhancing the surveillance footage and examining the vehicle's shape, size, and distinctive features, automotive experts determined that the car appeared to be a white Hyundai Elantra from model years 2011 to 2013. This was a specific enough identification to narrow down the search significantly. On December 15th, nearly a month after the murders, the Moscow Police Department made a public announcement that sent shockwaves through the investigation. They announced to the media and the public that they were actively looking for a white Hyundai Elantra, model years 2011 to 2013, that had been seen in the area around the time of the murders. They asked anyone who owned such a vehicle or knew someone who did to please come forward and contact the police. Behind the scenes, investigators began the massive and time-consuming task of looking through the vehicle registration records of more than 22,000 white Hyundai Elantras from those specific model years that were registered in Idaho, Washington, and surrounding states. It was like looking for a needle in a haystack, but investigators were determined to check every single one if necessary. The word was out to the public and to law enforcement agencies across the region to be on the lookout for this specific vehicle. Everyone was watching for white Hyundai Elantras. In no time at all, traffic cameras and other surveillance systems later captured footage of a white car matching this description near the Idaho-Washington state line, heading in the direction of Pullman, Washington. Pullman is a small college town where Washington State University is located. The university is only about 10 miles away from Moscow, Idaho, making it a short drive between the two college towns. Many students from both universities knew each other and socialized together because of the close proximity. A sharp and observant campus police officer at Washington State University heard about the search for white Hyundai Elantras and decided to take initiative. He began personally checking the campus parking lots and going through the vehicle registration records for white Elantras that were registered to students, faculty, or staff on the Washington State University campus. In no time at all, working diligently through the records, the officer found a vehicle that matched the general description investigators were looking for. The white Hyundai Elantra was parked in an apartment complex near the university campus. When he checked the registration records to see who owned the vehicle, he discovered it belonged to a graduate student named Bryan Kohberger. Bryan Kohberger was a 28-year-old PhD student studying criminology at Washington State University's Department of Criminal Justice and Criminology. Ironically, and disturbingly, he was studying the very field that would be used to catch him, the science of understanding and solving crimes. However, when investigators took a closer look at Kohberger's specific vehicle, They discovered that his Elantra turned out to be a slightly later model year than the original description that had been put out to the public based on the surveillance footage analysis. The original announcement had specified 2011 to 2013 model years, but Kohberger's car was a 2015 model. Despite this discrepancy in the model year, the car matched closely enough in appearance and other characteristics for investigators to decide they needed to take a much deeper look at this individual and his vehicle. Sometimes surveillance footage analysis isn't perfectly accurate, and model years that are close together can look nearly identical. As investigators dug deeper into Bryan Kohberger's background and activities, they discovered something else that was extremely suspicious and incriminating. Kohberger had received and registered a new license plate for his white Hyundai Elantra exactly 5 days after the murder incident occurred. This meant that on November 18th, just days after 4 people were brutally murdered and police were looking for a white Elantra, Kohberger had gone to the DMV, or Motor Vehicle Department, and gotten new plates for his car. This action seemed like a deliberate attempt to avoid being identified by his license plate number if anyone had recorded it or remembered seeing it near the crime scene. This suspicious timing raised enormous red flags for investigators and made Kohberger a prime suspect in the case. Bryan Kohberger grew up in the state of Pennsylvania on the east coast of the United States. He graduated from Pleasant Valley High School in 2013 when he was approximately 18 years old. After finishing high school, Kohberger continued his education, showing a clear interest in understanding the human mind and criminal behavior from early on. In 2018, 5 years after graduating from high school, Kohberger enrolled at Northampton Community College, a 2-year institution in Pennsylvania. There, he studied psychology, which is the scientific study of the human mind and behavior. He successfully completed his studies and earned an associate degree in psychology from the community college. From Northampton Community College, Kohberger transferred to DeSales University, a private Catholic university located in Center Valley, Pennsylvania, to continue his higher education. At DeSales University, he continued to focus on psychology and the study of human behavior. He worked hard in his studies and earned his bachelor's degree in psychology in 2020. But Kohberger didn't stop there. He continued his education at the same university and went on to complete a master's degree in criminal justice in 2022. During his time as a student at DeSales University, Kohberger studied under some notable and accomplished professors in the field of criminal justice and psychology. One of his professors was Katherine Ramsland, who is a well-known and respected expert on serial killers, people who murder multiple victims over a period of time. Professor Ramsland is so knowledgeable and experienced in this dark field that she had even helped Dennis Rader, also known by his terrifying nickname the BTK Killer, write his autobiography. He had strangled 10 people to death in Kansas during the mid-1970 seconds before he was finally caught decades later. The fact that Kohberger studied under someone who had such intimate knowledge of serial killers and their minds is deeply disturbing in hindsight. Kohberger also studied under another professor named Michelle Borger, who taught criminology courses at DeSales University. After Kohberger was arrested for the Idaho murders, Professor Borger spoke to the Daily Mail, a British news publication, about her former student. She described Kohberger as a brilliant student, meaning he was exceptionally intelligent and excelled in his academic work. She said he was outstanding in his classes and showed great promise as a scholar. But Professor Borger revealed something even more significant about Kohberger's academic abilities and potential. She explained that in her entire 10 years of experience as a criminology professor, teaching hundreds of students over the years, she had only recommended 2 students for acceptance into a PhD program. Getting a professor's recommendation for a PhD program is a significant honor and shows that the professor believes the student has exceptional potential. Bryan Kohberger was one of those 2 students that Professor Borger had recommended. This shows that he was not just a good student, but someone who was seen as having extraordinary talent and ability in the field of criminology, the study of crime and criminal behavior. By the summer of 2022, just months before the murders would occur, Kohberger had made a major life change. He moved all the way across the entire country, traveling from Pennsylvania on the East Coast to Washington State on the West Coast, a distance of nearly 3,000 miles. He relocated to the small college town of Pullman, Washington, where Washington State University is located. Kohberger had been accepted into Washington State University's highly competitive PhD program in criminology. This was a prestigious achievement and represented years of hard work and academic success. He was pursuing his doctorate degree, which would take several years to complete and would involve conducting original research in the field of criminology. At the time of the murders in November 2022, Kohberger had just completed his very first semester as a PhD student at Washington State University. He was still new to the area and to the university. At Washington State University, Kohberger continued to study under highly respected professors who were experts in their fields. One of his professors was particularly well known as an expert on serial killers and the psychology behind why they commit their horrific crimes. This professor would later be shocked to learn that one of their own students was accused of becoming the very thing they studied. Kohberger quickly became known among his faculty members and fellow students for his intense and sometimes unsettling curiosity about crime scenes and how investigators solve crimes. He was particularly fascinated by DNA evidence, the biological traces like blood, saliva, skin cells, and hair that criminals leave behind at crime scenes. DNA evidence has become one of the most powerful tools in modern criminal investigations because it can definitively link a suspect to a crime scene with scientific certainty. Kohberger would ask detailed questions in class about how crime scenes were processed, how DNA was collected and analyzed, and how investigators use this evidence to catch criminals. His professors and classmates noticed that his interests seemed to go beyond normal academic curiosity. He appeared almost obsessed with understanding every detail of how crimes were investigated and solved, particularly focusing on the forensic evidence that could connect a perpetrator to their crime. Looking back after his arrest, this intense focus on DNA evidence and crime scene investigation takes on a chilling new meaning. When investigators began focusing their attention on Bryan Kohberger as a potential suspect, the more they dug into his background and learned about him, the more intriguing and disturbing he became. He was not just another ordinary graduate student attending classes and studying for exams. He was a criminology student, someone who had spent years studying crime, criminal psychology, criminal behavior, and even the twisted minds of serial killers. That detail gave the entire case an unsettling and eerie new dimension that made investigators extremely concerned. A dark question hung in the air. Was Kohberger genuinely learning about murders and criminal investigations for academic purposes, or was he actually rehearsing and preparing for his own crimes? Was he studying how killers think so he could become one himself? Was he learning about forensic evidence so he would know how to avoid leaving it behind? As investigators continued to build their case against Kohberger, one of the disturbing things they learned was how he had been behaving when he worked as a teaching assistant at Washington State University. Teaching assistants, often called TAs, are graduate students who help professors teach undergraduate courses. They lead discussion sessions, grade papers, hold office hours, and interact regularly with undergraduate students. The women in his classes, in particular, felt extremely uneasy and uncomfortable whenever he was around them. They described feeling watched, targeted, or treated inappropriately by him. His presence made them anxious and afraid. The situation had become so concerning that some female students were actively avoiding walking home alone after class, specifically because of Bryan Kohberger. They were afraid of encountering him when they were by themselves. They would wait for friends, call for rides, or walk in groups because they didn't feel safe around him. The complaints were serious and specific. One female student had an interaction with Kohberger that was so tense, uncomfortable, and upsetting that she actually broke down in tears afterward. Beyond his inappropriate behavior toward female students, Kohberger's overall performance as a teaching assistant was also being called into question by the faculty. He apparently wasn't fulfilling his responsibilities well, wasn't treating students appropriately, and wasn't meeting the standards expected of someone in that position. The combination of the complaints about his conduct and his poor performance led the university to take action. On December 19th, about 5 weeks after the murders, Washington State University officially removed Bryan Kohberger from his position as a teaching assistant. This was a significant professional consequence that showed the university took the complaints seriously. He was no longer allowed to teach, interact with undergraduate students in an official capacity, or serve in that role. The timing is notable. This happened while investigators were already beginning to focus on him as a suspect in the murders, though the university's decision was based on the complaints from students and faculty, not on the criminal investigation. In the days that immediately followed, as investigators continued gathering evidence against Kohberger, they started to become increasingly confident and convinced that he was indeed the man they had been desperately searching for. Their suspicions were strengthened when they discovered body cam footage from several months earlier that provided another crucial link between Kohberger and the area where the murders occurred. The footage was from August 2022, about 3 months before the murders took place. It showed a traffic stop conducted by a police officer named Darren Duke, who had pulled over a speeding driver on the highway. This highway is the main road that connects Moscow, Idaho, and Pullman, Washington, the exact route that someone traveling between the crime scene and Washington State University would take. The drive is only about 10 miles and takes roughly 15 minutes. In the body cam video from that August traffic stop, the driver who had been pulled over for speeding was clearly identifiable as Bryan Kohberger. But what made this footage even more significant and incriminating was what he was driving. Kohberger was behind the wheel of the same white Hyundai Elantra that would later be tied directly to the murders through surveillance footage. This body cam footage proved several important things. Kohberger owned and regularly drove that specific white Elantra. He frequently traveled on the highway between Pullman and Moscow, and he was familiar with the route and the area where the victims lived. The August traffic stop showed that Kohberger had been driving back and forth on that highway between the two college towns months before the murders occurred. This suggested he may have been in Moscow multiple times before the night of the killings. Perhaps he had been stalking potential victims, surveilling the area, planning his attack, or visiting the neighborhood around King Road to become familiar with it. The body cam footage was another piece of evidence that was helping investigators build a comprehensive case against Bryan Kohberger, connecting him to the location, the vehicle, and the timeline of the murders. Days later, as winter break approached for the university, Bryan Kohberger made plans to drive all the way across the entire country back to his family home in Pennsylvania for the holidays. It was a long journey of nearly 3,000 miles that would take several days of driving. His father, who cared about his son and wanted to spend time with him, flew out to Washington State to join him for the cross-country road trip. The two planned to drive back together, father and son, sharing the driving duties and spending quality time together during the long journey home. During their trip eastward across the United States, Kohberger was even stopped by the Indiana police for speeding as they passed through that state. This was at least the second time that law enforcement had pulled him over for speeding in recent months, suggesting he had a tendency to drive too fast. The traffic stop was routine, and after receiving a ticket or warning, Kohberger and his father continued on their way toward Pennsylvania. When Kohberger finally reached his destination and arrived at his family home in Pennsylvania, he had no idea that investigators were already closing in on him from thousands of miles away. Behind the scenes, forensic scientists and detectives had been working around the clock to solve the puzzle of who had committed the murders in Moscow, Idaho. The DNA profile that had been carefully extracted and analyzed from the knife sheath found at the crime scene hadn't directly identified a specific suspect by name. DNA databases don't always contain everyone's genetic information. However, what the DNA analysis did reveal was incredibly valuable. It showed a family link or familial connection. The DNA from the knife sheath could be compared to DNA profiles in law enforcement databases, and while there wasn't an exact match to Bryan Kohberger himself, the system indicated that someone in his family tree was already in the database. This gave investigators a crucial lead to follow. However, investigators and prosecutors knew that this single piece of touch DNA from the knife sheath wasn't enough evidence on its own to build a case strong enough to hold up in court and result in a conviction. Touch DNA refers to the tiny amounts of genetic material that people leave behind simply by touching objects with their skin. While it can be analyzed, defense attorneys often challenge its reliability. Investigators needed to gather DNA directly from Bryan Kohberger himself and compare it against the crime scene sample to create an undeniable, direct match that would stand up to scrutiny in a courtroom. At the time, Kohberger was staying at his parents' home, which was located inside a gated community called Indian Mountain Lake in Pennsylvania. A gated community is a residential area with controlled entrances that provide security and privacy for residents. The first step for investigators in their plan to obtain Kohberger's DNA was relatively simple and didn't require a warrant. They would retrieve discarded household trash from the family's garbage and search through it for anything that might carry his DNA, such as tissues, used cups, eating utensils, or other items he might have touched or used. However, once Kohberger arrived back in Pennsylvania and settled into his parents' home, his behavior changed dramatically in ways that alarmed investigators who were watching him. He became hyper-vigilant, which means extremely alert and watchful. He seemed almost paranoid, constantly looking around and being overly cautious about everything he did. He became extraordinarily careful not to leave fingerprints or genetic material anywhere, taking precautions that went far beyond normal behavior. For someone who was a criminology PhD student studying crime and forensic investigation, being knowledgeable about DNA evidence and fingerprints could seem somewhat normal. It was literally his field of study. But given all the other evidence that was already tying him to the Idaho murders, this sudden hypervigilant behavior raised the level of suspicion among investigators to new heights. His actions suggested he knew he was being investigated and was trying to avoid leaving evidence that could be used against him. During his time as a student at DeSales University, before moving to Washington State, Kohberger had extensively studied the psychology and motives of criminals. He had also studied in detail how prosecutors gather evidence to build cases against suspects, what types of evidence are most valuable in court, and how forensic science is used to link suspects to crimes. He understood exactly how law enforcement worked and what they would be looking for. Armed with this knowledge from his studies, Kohberger began taking extreme precautions. He decided to wear gloves everywhere he went, even for mundane everyday tasks. He wore gloves while taking out the garbage, a task that most people would never think requires hand protection. He even wore gloves while cleaning his car, meticulously wiping down surfaces to avoid leaving any trace of himself behind. This obsessive behavior was highly unusual and suggested consciousness of guilt. He was acting like someone who knew police were trying to collect his DNA. Kohberger also made another significant change to his behavior that caught investigators' attention. He completely stopped using his debit and credit cards for purchases. Financial transactions create electronic records that can be tracked and used to establish someone's location and activities. By switching to cash only, Kohberger was trying to avoid creating a paper trail that investigators could follow. This is exactly the kind of evasive behavior that guilty people often engage in when they know they're under suspicion. When investigators from the Pennsylvania State Police finally managed to collect trash from the Kohberger family home and had it rushed to a forensic laboratory for testing, they ran DNA analysis on items they found in the garbage. However, the results were initially disappointing and frustrating. The DNA they extracted from the trash didn't match exactly to the suspect profile that had been developed from the knife sheath found at the crime scene in Idaho. This was a setback, but investigators weren't ready to give up. The clever investigators came up with an alternative plan that would work around this obstacle. They realized that since there were two adult men living in the household, Bryan Kohberger and his father, and the DNA sample from the knife sheath was confirmed to be male DNA, they could run what's called a paternity comparison or familial DNA analysis. While Bryan Kohberger had become hypervigilant and extremely careful about not leaving his DNA anywhere, being paranoid and taking excessive precautions, his father was not similarly careful. His father had no idea he was under any kind of investigation and was living his life normally, not taking any special precautions. The investigators were able to easily obtain DNA samples from Kohberger's father from trash or other sources without any difficulty. They sent these samples to the forensic laboratory for analysis. When the DNA test results came back from the lab, they provided exactly the breakthrough and the match that investigators desperately needed to move forward with the case. The science behind the match was solid and convincing. Bryan Kohberger's father was a first-degree biological relative of Bryan, sharing approximately 50% of his DNA with his son, as all parents and children do. The STR profile, short tandem repeat profile, which is the type of DNA analysis used in forensic investigations, was strong enough and detailed enough to conclusively link back to Bryan Kohberger as the source of the DNA on the knife sheath. The statistical analysis showed that the odds of the DNA on the knife sheath belonging to anyone else other than Bryan Kohberger were astronomically low, 99.9% certain it was him. In scientific terms, this is considered essentially a definitive match. That was the exact moment when investigators knew with 100% certainty that Bryan Kohberger was the person they had been searching for. He was their killer. The DNA evidence, combined with all the other evidence they had gathered, the white Elantra, his proximity to the crime scene, his suspicious behavior, his knowledge of forensic techniques, all pointed undeniably to him as the perpetrator of the 4 murders in Moscow, Idaho. With this conclusive DNA evidence in hand, law enforcement moved quickly to make the arrest before Kohberger could flee or harm anyone else. The FBI immediately assembled a specialized tactical team on the ground in Pennsylvania. A highly trained SWAT team, Special Weapons and Tactics, consisting of heavily armed officers wearing tactical gear and body armor, was quietly positioned in the woods surrounding the Kohberger family home in the Indian Mountain Lake gated community. They moved into position under cover of darkness, hiding among the trees and establishing a perimeter around the residence to ensure Kohberger couldn't escape when they moved in. In the early morning hours of the 30th of December 2022, just before dawn when most people were still asleep, the law enforcement team made their move. They had obtained an arrest warrant signed by a judge, giving them legal authority to take Kohberger into custody. The officers surrounded the residence from all sides, blocking any possible escape routes. Federal agents from the FBI, along with officers from the Pennsylvania State Police, then stormed into the home with their weapons drawn, moving swiftly and decisively to secure the premises. Bryan Kohberger was awake inside the house when the agents burst through the doors. Perhaps he'd been unable to sleep, or perhaps he sensed that his time was running out. The officers quickly located him, ordered him to the ground, and placed him in handcuffs. He was read his rights and formally arrested for the murders of Madison Mogen, Kaylee Goncalves, Xana Kernodle, and Ethan Chapin. After his arrest, Kohberger was immediately transported to the Monroe County Correctional Facility, a jail located in Stroudsburg, Pennsylvania. He was detained there without bond, which meant he was not allowed to post bail and be released while awaiting trial. The judge determined he was too dangerous and too much of a flight risk to be released. Kohberger would remain in custody at the Pennsylvania jail while the lengthy extradition proceedings took place. Extradition is the legal process of transferring a suspect from one state to another to face criminal charges. Since the crimes occurred in Idaho, Kohberger would eventually need to be transported back to Idaho to stand trial, but this process would take several weeks to complete through the court system. Once the extradition was officially approved by the courts in Pennsylvania, the Pennsylvania State Police arranged to transport Bryan Kohberger back to Idaho to face the murder charges. Rather than driving him across the country or using commercial transportation, they flew him on their own police aircraft directly to Idaho. This ensured security and prevented any potential escape attempts or public disruptions. Upon arrival in Idaho, Kohberger was immediately taken to the Latah County Jail, where he would be held in custody while awaiting trial. As part of the comprehensive criminal investigation, all of Kohberger's electronic devices were seized by law enforcement. This included his cell phone, computer, tablet, and any other devices that might contain evidence. Investigators hoped these devices would contain crucial information about his activities, communications, internet searches, and movements before and after the murders. However, investigators faced a significant challenge and setback. Before law enforcement had managed to obtain and seize his electronic devices, Kohberger had methodically wiped them completely clean. He had deleted files, cleared browsing histories, erased messages, and removed any data that might be incriminating. For someone with his knowledge of criminal investigations and digital forensics, he knew exactly what investigators would be looking for and took steps to eliminate that evidence. This deliberate destruction of evidence was another indication of his consciousness of guilt and his attempts to cover his tracks. Despite Kohberger's efforts to erase all traces of evidence from his devices, investigators were not completely thwarted. Using advanced forensic recovery techniques and working with digital forensics experts, they were able to recover some deleted data. What they discovered was deeply disturbing and revealing. They found that Kohberger had saved numerous screenshots and photos of news coverage of the killings. He had been following the media reports about the murders, saving articles, news stories, and updates about the investigation. This behavior suggested he was monitoring how the investigation was progressing and what information law enforcement was releasing to the public. It also showed a disturbing fascination with his own crimes and their aftermath. Bryan Kohberger's cell phone records became some of the most damning and incriminating evidence against him in the entire case. Cell phones constantly communicate with nearby cell towers, creating a detailed record of where the phone was located at any given time. This data can be subpoenaed by law enforcement and used to track a person's movements with remarkable precision. The forensic analysis of Kohberger's phone records revealed extremely suspicious activity on the night of the murders. The data showed that on that fateful night, his cell phone shut off at exactly 2:47 a.m. This was approximately 1 hour and 17 minutes before the murders are believed to have occurred. Turning off a phone prevents it from communicating with cell towers and creating location records. Exactly what someone would do if they were trying to hide their movements and location during the commission of a crime. Hours later, after 4:30 a.m., which was shortly after the murders had been completed, Kohberger's phone powered back on. Once it reconnected to the cellular network, the phone record showed clear movement and travel from the Moscow, Idaho area back into Pullman, Washington, where Kohberger lived. The timing was incredibly suspicious and aligned perfectly with the timeline of the murders. He had turned off his phone just before driving to the crime scene, committed the murders while his phone was off and not creating location records, and then turned it back on after fleeing the scene and driving back toward his home. But as investigators dug even deeper into Kohberger's historical phone records from the weeks and months before the murders, they discovered an even more troubling and sinister pattern of behavior. The detailed cell tower records revealed that on at least 12 different separate occasions before the killings took place, Kohberger's cell phone had been physically located in the King Road neighborhood where the victims lived. He hadn't just driven by once or twice. He had visited the area a dozen times. Even more disturbing was the timing of these visits. The phone records showed that Kohberger had often been in that neighborhood in the middle of the night, during the very early morning hours when most people were asleep. There was no innocent explanation for why a graduate student from Washington State University would repeatedly visit a residential neighborhood in Moscow, Idaho, late at night. The pattern suggested he had been stalking the house, surveilling his potential victims, studying their routines, and planning his attack. Perhaps he was watching to see when lights went on and off, determining who lived there, identifying entry points, and choosing the best time to strike. This evidence painted a picture of premeditation and careful planning rather than a spontaneous act of violence. After his arrest and extradition back to Idaho, the legal case against Bryan Kohberger moved quickly through the court system. On the 5th of January 2023, just days after his arrest on the 30th of December 2022, Bryan Kohberger made his very first appearance in the Latah County Courthouse. He stood before a judge wearing an orange jail jumpsuit as the formal charges against him were read aloud in court. Kohberger was formally and officially charged with 1 count of felony burglary for illegally entering the King Road house, and 4 separate counts of first-degree murder for the intentional and premeditated killings of Madison Mogen, Kaylee Goncalves, Xana Kernodle, and Ethan Chapin. Each of these murder charges carried the possibility of extremely severe punishment, life in prison without the possibility of parole, or even the death penalty. Idaho is one of the states that still allows capital punishment for the most serious murder cases. The judge presiding over the case made several important decisions during this initial court appearance. First, the trial denied Kohberger bail entirely, meaning he would not be allowed to post any amount of money to be released from jail while awaiting trial. The judge determined that the evidence against him was strong. The crimes were extremely serious and violent, and he posed both a danger to the community and a significant flight risk if released. Second, the judge issued strict no-contact orders that legally prohibited Kohberger from having any communication whatsoever with the victims' families or with the 2 surviving roommates, Dylan Mortensen and Bethany Funke. This was to protect them from intimidation, harassment, or any further trauma. The legal proceedings continued to move forward through the spring of 2023. On the 17th of May 2023, a grand jury was convened to hear evidence in the case. A grand jury is a group of citizens who review evidence presented by prosecutors and decide whether there is enough evidence to formally indict someone and proceed to trial. After hearing testimony and examining evidence, the grand jury formally indicted Bryan Kohberger on 5 total charges: 4 counts of first-degree murder, 1 for each victim, and 1 count of felony burglary for breaking into the home. Originally, a probable cause hearing had been scheduled for June 2023. This hearing would have been a court proceeding where prosecutors would present evidence to a judge to demonstrate that there was probable cause to believe Kohberger committed the crimes. However, because the grand jury had already indicted him, this probable cause hearing was canceled and was no longer necessary. The grand jury indictment served the same legal purpose. When the time came for Kohberger's arraignment, which is the court hearing where a defendant is formally asked to enter a plea of guilty or not guilty to the charges, something unusual happened. Kohberger stood before the judge but refused to enter any plea at all. He wouldn't say guilty and he wouldn't say not guilty. He simply remained silent. His attorney, speaking on his behalf, told the court that Kohberger was standing silent, which is a defendant's legal right. However, the legal system requires that a plea be entered so the case can proceed. Because of Kohberger's refusal to speak, the judge was required by law to enter a not guilty plea on his behalf. This meant the case would proceed to trial, where prosecutors would have to prove his guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. On the 26th of June, 2023, Bill Thompson, who was the top prosecutor and prosecuting attorney in Latah County, made a major announcement that sent shockwaves through the case and captured national attention. He announced publicly that the state of Idaho would be seeking the death penalty against Bryan Kohberger. This meant that if Kohberger was convicted of the murders at trial, prosecutors would ask the jury to sentence him to death by execution rather than life in prison. The decision to seek the death penalty is not made lightly and is reserved for only the most heinous and aggravated murder cases. The brutal nature of the crimes, the fact that 4 young people were killed, and the apparent premeditation all factored into this decision. Kohberger was again denied bond and remained in custody at the Latah County Jail as the mountain of evidence against him continued to grow. By September 2024, more than a year and a half after the murders, the case had grown so large, so complex, and attracted so much intense media attention and public interest that continuing to hold the trial in the small town of Moscow, Idaho, became impractical and potentially unfair. Moscow is a small college town with a population of only about 25,000 people. The murders had deeply affected the entire community, and virtually everyone in town had heard about the case and likely formed opinions about it. Finding an impartial jury in Moscow would be extremely difficult or impossible. Understanding these concerns, the defense attorneys filed a motion requesting a change of venue. The judge granted the change of venue motion and ordered that the trial would be moved to Boise, which is the capital city and largest city in Idaho, located several hours south of Moscow. Boise has a much larger population and a bigger jury pool, making it more likely that impartial jurors could be selected who hadn't been directly affected by the case. Bryan Kohberger was transported from the Latah County Jail to Boise under extremely heavy security. Law enforcement wanted to ensure there were no escape attempts and no incidents during the transfer. He was flown south by aircraft and delivered to the Ada County Jail in Boise, where he would remain in custody while awaiting his trial. In October 2024, the court announced that the trial date needed to be pushed back and delayed. The trial had originally been scheduled to begin in June 2025, but due to the complexity of the case, the enormous amount of evidence that needed to be reviewed, and various pretrial motions that needed to be resolved, the judge moved the trial date back to August 2025. This gave both the prosecution and defense more time to prepare their cases. However, in a stunning and unexpected turn of events, on the 30th of June 2025, just weeks before his trial was scheduled to finally begin, Bryan Kohberger reached a plea deal with prosecutors. After more than 2.5 years of maintaining his innocence through his not guilty plea and preparing for trial, Kohberger apparently decided that he did not want to face a jury and risk the death penalty. The terms of the plea agreement were significant. Kohberger agreed to plead guilty to all charges against him, all 4 counts of first-degree murder and the burglary charge. In exchange for this guilty plea, prosecutors agreed not to seek the death penalty. Instead, Kohberger would accept 4 consecutive life sentences, meaning the sentences would be served one after another rather than at the same time, ensuring he would never be released from prison. He would spend the rest of his natural life behind bars until he died. Additionally, as part of the plea deal, Kohberger gave up his right to appeal his conviction or sentence. This meant he could never challenge the conviction in a higher court or try to get his sentence reduced. The deal was final and permanent, ensuring he would die in prison. On July 2nd, 2025, Bryan Kohberger stood before the court in Boise for one of the most important hearings in the case. In front of the judge, the victims' families, prosecutors, his own attorneys, and the watching public and media, Kohberger formally and officially pleaded guilty to 4 counts of first-degree murder for killing Madison Mogen, Kaylee Goncalves, Xana Kernodle, and Ethan Chapin, and he also pleaded guilty to 1 count of felony burglary for illegally entering their home. It was the first time he had publicly admitted his guilt and taken responsibility for these horrific crimes. 3 weeks later, on the 23rd of July 2025, Kohberger returned to court for his sentencing hearing. The judge handed down the sentence that had been agreed upon in the plea deal: 4 consecutive life terms in prison without any possibility of parole, meaning he would never be eligible for release. Additionally, he received 10 extra years for the burglary charge, though this was largely symbolic since he was already sentenced to die in prison. Along with the prison time, the judge also ordered Kohberger to pay substantial financial penalties. He was ordered to pay $250,000 in fines to the state and $20,000 in restitution payments to the victims' families to partially compensate them for their losses, though no amount of money could ever truly compensate for the loss of their loved ones.